Chapter 6. Abraham's Other Son. In Chapter 5, we met a man who we learned would become the father of a great nation. But Abraham and his wife, Sarah, became impatient for the fulfillment of God's promise. A son named Ishmael was born to Abraham through Hagar, but he was not the promised son. Sometimes we think that one little act of disobedience will not really hurt anyone. But as we are going to see in this chapter of our story, this is exceedingly untrue. We are about to start a two-part study about two men. One was born from disobedience and would always carry and live with the knowledge that he was not the chosen one. The other man was the chosen one. He was the favored son, the father of a chosen nation. His lineage would lead straight to the cross and the way of forgiveness for all mankind. In our next chapter, we will learn about Isaac, the chosen son, and his descendants. But for now, I want to spend some time with Ishmael and his descendants before Ishmael was born. The Lord said about him in Genesis 16:11-12. And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. He shall be a wild man, his hands against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of his brethren." I would not want to hear this said about one of my babies, but this is exactly what Ishmael became. The birth of Ishmael caused much tension between Abram, Sarah, Hagar, Ishmael, and Isaac. Rather than waiting for God to fulfill his promise, they jumped ahead and tried to make that promise happen. Instead, they only succeeded in creating strife amongst themselves. The peak of this conflict was many years after Ishmael's birth. But Sarah was very unhappy with how Ishmael treated Isaac. She demanded that Abraham send Ishmael and his mother away. The Bible makes it clear that Abraham loved Ishmael and was unhappy with Sarah's request. And why shouldn't he be? Ishmael was the firstborn son. However, God told Abraham that Isaac was the promised son and would be his heir. God also promised Abraham that Ishmael would become the father of a nation. Hagar, Sarah's maid and Ishmael's mother, was sent away, taking her son with her. As Genesis tells us, Hagar became discouraged during the journey and was convinced that her son would die in the desert. However, God appeared to her and told her the same thing that he had told Abraham. After Hagar and Ishmael were sent away, they lived in the wilderness. Hagar also sought a wife for her son from her own people in Egypt, and Ishmael married a woman of his mother's choosing from the maidens there. Not much else is known about Ishmael through the Bible, though the Bible does mention that he and Isaac buried their father together, and his descendants, the Ishmaelites, are also occasionally mentioned. He had many sons, and his daughter eventually married Isaac's son Esau, whom we will read about later. For this reason, Ishmael was one of the ancestors of the Edomites, a country that bordered ancient Israel. However, Ishmael is known more now for being considered the ancestor of the Arabs. In his lifetime, Ishmael became the unquestioned leader of the desert people of the Arabian Peninsula. His descendants settled near the border of Egypt and became nomads called Bedouins. Bedouins still live here and in other parts of the Middle East. The land is a vast desert. Perhaps you've seen pictures of the Arabian desert. It occupies almost all of the Arabian Peninsula and is characterized by miles of sand dunes, as well as rugged mountains. Water is hard to find and essential for survival. The heat in the summer is so intense, sometimes reaching up to 130 degrees. That's scorching hot. The temperature drops considerably at night, however. Winters are also not hot, with temperatures sometimes dropping below freezing. The desert receives little rain, and when it does rain, it often floods. Windstorms are common and are largely responsible for the shapes of the sand dunes. People now and in ancient times knew that they could not really farm this land, though they did raise livestock. Camels are used for transportation because they can go for long periods of time without water. That's a valuable trait in an area where water is scarce. Even today, Bedouins often have large sheep and goat herds. The Bedouins also bred fast horses called Arabians. These animals were used on raids and to this day are renowned for their endurance. One advantage of the area had throughout the years was that many important trade routes passed through or near the desert. This was a source of income, either due to trading or raiding. Merchants often traveled in caravans for their own protection against attacks. A caravan is a large group of people traveling together. Arabian caravans used camels. The caravans carried frankincense and myrrh, both of which were used for perfumes and fragrances. They grew in Arabia and were carried by ships or caravan routes to faraway places in Africa, Europe, and Eastern Asia. Other desirable goods carried by caravans included spices, gold, and precious stones. This trade route was called the incense route, since many of the goods being traded, like frankincense, could be used to make incense. Ancient civilizations used incense for religious purposes, but it also served a much more practical purpose. Ancient cities often smelled really bad. This might have been hard for us to imagine now, but it would not be unusual to walk down a street and smell garbage or even sewage during these times. Sweet-smelling incense masked these smells, which is why the goods to make incense were in such high demand. Arabian caravans on the incense route and other trade routes would stop at a predetermined place called a caravanserai. These places provided the traders a place to stop and rest for safety. Some of these places could be quite small, comparatively speaking, but major cities also developed along the trade routes. Petra, in modern-day Jordan, is one such city. Built by Nabatean Arabs over 1,000 years after Ishmael's time, the city grew immensely wealthy from doing business with traders who came up from Arabia and other points. In modern times, caravans are much less important than they were in early historical periods. They still happen, but they are not major forms of trade, since many modern methods of transportation are much quicker. One of the biggest economic activities in the Arabian Peninsula, and indeed the world, is the oil fields that were discovered there in 1930s. The industry has made Saudi Arabia and many of its neighboring countries very wealthy. Though Ishmael was a descendant of Abraham, who worshiped the one true God, his descendants did not. In ancient times, these people group all had their own gods and belief systems, some sharing gods and idol worship with their neighbors. The development of their own completely separate belief system happened many centuries later when the Islamic religion was formed. We will learn more about that in the next volume of the series. As you will see throughout reading this book, many of the areas we study were controlled by major empires during ancient history. For the most part, these empires never controlled the Arabian Peninsula, partly due to the harshness of the terrain and climate.